Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and I'd like you to tune in, turn on, and drop out, at least for the next hour, as we take the first of our trips down the twisting tunnels and kaleidoscopic corridors, the layered labyrinths of the metamorphosizing molecule called D-lysergic acid diethylamide tartrate 25. LSD, acid as most of us would call it. We're in search of some of the stories and characters who made it one of the fluids that fueled the counterculture. Now, some of those figures are well known: Hoffman, Owsley, Ken Kesey, Ramdas, and of course Timothy Leary. And some of the locations that feature in the landscape of acid: the Sandoz Laboratories, the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, Ken Kesey's farm, may be familiar to us, but I, for one, did not think that Darlington, an industrial town in the north of England, should be listed amongst those locations, nor that a British man was so influential in the birth and spread of acid and the psychedelic movement. And I'm not talking about Aldous Huxley, that urbane literary figure. I'm talking about the strangely strange creature Michael Hollingshead, the man who turned on the world, as he described himself rather immodestly, the Divine Rascal, as his biographer called him. Well, with all trips, it's usually best to have an experienced guide, so I'm very pleased that we have the author of that biography with us to take us through the bizarre, amazing, odd life and times of Michael Hollingshead. Our guest is the psychedelic researcher, Andy Roberts. Hello, Andy.
Hi there.
Welcome, Andy. I always chicken out when it comes to giving people's biographies. Less work for me, but also probably more interesting for the listener to hear it from the source. So tell us, who is Andy Roberts?
In the real world, I am a project worker, support worker in hostels for homeless people, and have been on and off for the past 31 years in one form or another. In my real world, which is a completely different thing, I am an author, researcher, investigator into a wide range of phenomena. I started off life being very, very interested in UFO and the UFO mythos. I've been involved in paranormal research of all kinds. I've done an awful lot of work on various sort of arcane British strands of music, such as the Incredible String Band and Dr. Strangely Strange. And latterly, over the past sort of 15 years, I've drifted into research into Britain's psychedelic history. And I did that because I've always had a massive interest in Britain's psychedelic history and in LSD specifically, and I couldn't believe it in the sort of early to mid 2000s when I found that there was no book dealing with the history of LSD in Britain. Quite a staggering thing, really. So I thought, well, if I don't write it, who will?
And you did write it, and that's the book Albion Dreaming, and I'm hoping that we're going to come back and do a whole episode on that book, on that history. But your book, Divine Rascal, the biography of Michael Hollingshead, is also an amazing piece of psychedelic research.
Thank you.
And what a life. But before we dig into that life, let's just go back a little bit. The history of the psychedelic movement and acid is so wrapped up with the history of counterculture in the 50s, 60s and 70s that it'd be good to start there. I like to ask our guests just to say a few words about what they understand is the meaning of the word counterculture. What do you think?
Very interesting. It just means anything that runs contrary to, to the accepted norms of what I like to call the establishment with a capital E, which is the sort of the where politics, industry, the military and religion all come together. They form the British establishment, which keeps Britain British and gives us the reputation we have in the world. Whereas the counterculture is any strand that runs counter to that. So you could have had counterculture 300 or 400 years ago when you had the levelers for interest, for instance. Whereas now in the last century we've had the beatniks and then the hippies. So it's people who are actively dissatisfied with the status quo and believe that there is much more to their life, society's life, and the universe at large.
Yeah, that's very much my feeling too. It's like whenever there's consciously been a culture, there's unconsciously been a counterculture that became conscious in itself, I guess, in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And obviously a very important part of that was this psychedelic narrative. in which Michael Hollingshead, played a forgotten but pivotal part. You described him, Andy, as a Zelig, a fool, a trickster, a black magician, a charlatan, a genius, a fabulist, a junkie, an alcoholic, a secret agent, police informer perhaps, a disruptor, a guru, somebody who was sex mad but didn't understand love. Is that right?
It was all those and probably a lot of the other things as well, and that's what makes him fascinating, because he cannot be pinned down to any one sort of archetype or character.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, I suppose, if he's famous for anything, he's famous as being the man who introduced Timothy Leary, the acid guru, who went on to have such an incredible effect on the counterculture in America, that he introduced Leary to acid. So why don't we start with that, the truth of that, and then backtrack and find out how Hollingshead got to that place from Darlington.
That, as you say, is what most people know about Michael Hollingshead. And as I grew up and I was reading all the sort of, stuff about Leary and the psychedelic counterculture in America, his name kept cropping up over and over again, saying, this was the guy who turned Leary onto LSD. But very few articles or histories mentioned him much past that. It was almost as though LSD culture was purely the province of America, and Britain was just like a sideline to all this. Whereas when you dig into it, Britain played a massive role in the origin of the counterculture in America. And the fact that a British guy from a very working class family in Darlington was the guy who turned Timothy Leary onto acid, I think is an absolutely amazing thing that should be made more of, because why him? Why then? Why Leary? Leary had access to acid before Hollingshead, had he chose to do so, yet it took this guy all his efforts to get hold of Leary to persuade him to take acid, and it took him several weeks to get him to take it. And then when he had done that, really, that moment when Hollingshead turned Leary onto acid effectively changed the world, because Leary was then responsible for, spreading it as it's become spread today, for better or for worse, depending on your opinion of Leary.
Yeah, and I mean, Hollingshead rather immodestly described himself as being the man who turned on the world, I suppose because he turned on Leary and Leary had such a big effect. In London we have these blue plaques on buildings to commemorate significant historical figures. I'm assuming that in Darlington there isn't a sort of technical or psychedelic one for Hollingshead.
Not at all. And strangely, when I was sort of doing research for the book, I contacted the local newspaper there and said, did you know that, this guy who grew up in Darlington was responsible for turning Leary and the world on? Because I thought they might find it vaguely newsworthy. And after 2 or 3 emails and letters, I didn't get one single response. It's almost as though they just don't want to know him.
Yeah, right. I suppose it doesn't fit in with the obvious sort of son of the town of the industrial north image maybe that they want to portray. Okay, but Andy, let us back up the truck. Let's go to Darlington and just bring him from there to the States and living with Timothy Leary. Let's fill in that big gap.
Okay. Well, Hollingshead was born in the early 30s in Darlington, and in the early 30s, I mean, Darlington's not exactly the prettiest of towns these days, but in the early 30s it was still a very, very grimy sort of post-industrial town, famous for railways and the hundreds of coal mines that were all around the area. It was very much the sort of area that was a man's world, really. You either worked down the pit or your family worked down the pit or something like that. And Hollingshead's father was a colliery manager, and by all accounts, and family history is quite hard to come by, incidentally, by all accounts he was sort of, rough and tough, a man's man, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. And the story that I've heard from Hollingshead's daughter Vanessa, who heard it in turn from her father, was that Hollingshead's father was quite sort of rough and violent and a really heavy drinker, as was the way with many men in that era, and he frequently committed acts of domestic violence against his mother. And as Hollingshead grew a little bit older, I think he stumbled in on one of these times when his father was beating his mother, and tried, as young children would try to do, to intervene and protect him. And his mother completely turned on him and sort of said, don't ever do that again, ignore what you see. And he said at that moment, or he told his daughter at that moment, that he threw away the key, i.e. he had he didn't want anything more to do with it, with his family, because he just couldn't understand, the social dynamic of domestic violence and why his mother, wanted him not to get involved in it. Now, in retrospect, it's sort of known that this is often the pattern with domestic violence sufferers, that they will actively rebel against their children or family if they try to stop it. It's just one of those peculiar psychological things.
And actually, that's interesting. So at that moment, that was a kind of countercultural moment for him then. So he was turning against his own culture at that point, presumably.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, he was at school at that time, obviously, and by all accounts, he did quite well. He was reasonably intelligent, liked playing football. There was nothing really to mark him out. But then I think it was around when he was about 10 or 11, I think it was, something happened. Now, this is the sort of crux of Hollingshead's life story. Something happened. He did something which led to him being sent to for want of a better word, a special school in Surrey. Now, these days you might think, well, yeah, that's fair enough. If somebody does something naughty, they might get sent away. But there are some big problems with this, because his family do not know his remaining family don't know what he did. And the school that he was sent to, which is Red Hill School in Surrey, was a school to which only 40 people a year from the whole of Britain went to. And if you read the literature about it, it was for people with extreme sort of psychosocial problems, people who've attacked people, sexual offenders, and social deviants generally. So he must have done something quite bad, really, to get sent 200 and odd miles from Darlington to this school, which is a residential school. He could only come home at school holidays, and he was there for 2 or 3 years.
So Vanessa, his daughter, never knew what it was that he'd done?
No, the only person alive today who knows what he did is his sister, Jeanette, but she has been uncooperative throughout the whole writing process. I don't think she wanted his story to come out in any way, shape or form, not just the early part of his life, but the stuff that he did later. So I've had to piece it together largely from what Vanessa has told me.
So that is like sort of 2 major ruptures with his background then?
That's right, at a very early age, sort of pre-teen, which is, someone's formative years. And then, he was sent to this school, this residential school, which was run on the principles of sort of psychoanalysis. The kids there were allowed to call the teachers by their first name. The kids there made their own rules and had their own sort of council in which they decided punishments for people who'd broken those rules. It was very, very, very revolutionary for the 1940s. And Hollingshead seemed to thrive there. There are some extant examples of the school newspaper, school magazine, which came out 2 or 3 times a year. And Hollingshead was a prolific contributor. He wrote poems and he did artwork for it, and some sort of quite humorous, dry skits about teachers and so on and so forth. So it was quite obvious that he really got on in that environment. Now, when I was doing research, I got in touch with people from that school at that time, and managed to get a few people to tell me what he was like, and they all said he was very, very quite charismatic. He was very good at I won't use the word manipulation, but at that age he was very good at getting people to do what he wanted them to do. He was an extremely good mimic, and could mimic teachers down to a T, to the point where he mimicked one teacher so much that the teacher punched him and knocked a tooth out. And he was always at the centre of things that were going on. So from an early age, once he was away from his family, he must have thought to himself, this is a big, bad, wide world out here, and I'm going to make it work for me. And he just got on and did that.
Also, you can see there the roots of what he became as well, with the charisma and the ability to either manipulate / kind of influence people, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what happened next then?
Well, he left. He was there for 3 or 4 years, and he left school, and we know he went to national service. He went to national service, and originally was stationed on the Wirral at the sort of training barracks there, and I have a photograph of him, I think, in the book, of him in his uniform with his rifle and everything. But unfortunately, I never managed to track his national service records down.
Just for anybody who doesn't know, national service was the obligatory 2-year period, was it, that all young people, young men at least, had to spend in the armed forces or service or something similar in the post-war period?
If they weren't in a reserved occupation, they had to go and do this 2 years. So he went into the RAF. We know that, but we don't know what he did there. But the interesting thing about it is the next time we know something about him, when he's back in London after doing his national service, he appears to be fluent in at least in Norwegian and possibly in other Scandinavian languages. So the chances are that he did some form of language training whilst he was on national service, because otherwise they certainly didn't teach those languages at the schools he went to. So he must have got that from somewhere. So it's a fair bet that he did that. Now, just sort of jumping forward a little bit, a lot of people have sort of tried to imply that Hollingshead was in some way, working for the government in some secret capacity. And people say, well, when he was in national service, that's why you can't find his records, because it's all been hidden away, and that's when he was trained in this, that, and the other, so he could be unleashed into the counterculture when he came out. I don't necessarily believe that, but it's an interesting concept, because I've never been able to find out one single thing about his national service other than he was in the RAF element of it.
Right, well, so mystery is already gathering around him.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then he finishes with that, returns to civilian life, I guess, whatever you call it.
That's right. He spent some time in London for a while, and we think that's where he first met someone who would be very significant in his life later on, Desmond O'Brien, and he had some involvement apparently with a theatre company in London, but details are hazy. And then suddenly he appears in I think he goes to Sweden then, and he ends up marrying a Swedish woman, and he's fluent in Swedish, and he ends up on Swedish radio doing lots of programmes about Britain, about British literature, about British travel, and so on and so forth. And he was quite it's quite well known in those parts. And I've actually, found some of the programmes that he did. I haven't got the originals of them, but I found the reference to them in their TV schedules. So it was a bit of a mover and a shaker. He knew how to make the most of any opportunity given to him. His marriage in Sweden fell apart, basically, so he came back to London in the late 50s, and he hooked up with Desmond O'Brien, and he also hooked up with some names that might be familiar to listeners, one of whom was Alex Trochy, the poet and writer, and the other one was Brian Barrett, who was a very early mover and shaker on the British beatnik stroke acid scene. Wrote a book called The Road of Excess, and he was involved with those people. And their thing in the late 50s was they used to drink heavily, because Hollingshead was a really heavy drinker, having sort of learnt that in his upbringing. And they also liked to use any other drugs they could get hold of, marijuana if they could, heroin, and any pills. And I've heard stories that him and those three characters used to go to all the really posh dancers and hotels in London, where they would basically pick up very well-off debutantes and use them for financial purposes to sort of oil their partying and things like that. They were a bit of rough to the debutantes' poshness, if you like, which, in late 1950s London was quite probably thought to be quite thrilling. Anyway, after a while, he got quite bored of all this, and he decided to start a new life in America. So I think it was late 1959, he boarded a ship. His occupation is listed as writer, I think, and he sailed to New York.
It's quite amazing already, isn't it, really, for somebody from that background? It reminds me a little bit of that whole sort of late 50s angry young men, so-called angry young men movement, with Kingsley Amis and Stan Barstow and, of course, Colin Wilson, the occult writer, and Keith Waterhouse and all those, coming from the north, coming down to the south, into a province which had previously been, occupied entirely by rather sort of urbane, middle class, upper middle class, and then social changes are happening in Great Britain, and so you get somebody like Hollingshead coming down and disrupting that.
I mean, I think he probably saw himself in that vein. He was very well read for someone who hadn't had, a massive amount of education, and certainly not a university education. So he knew how to sort of interact in those circles. And also, every single person that I've ever met have said he was extremely clever probably to sort of genius level. I think when he was at Red Hill School, he had his IQ tested and it was at genius level then. He just seemed to be one of those people who, irrespective of formal education, had an innate, natural intelligence that he could apply to any situation. And because of his talents, in mimicry and sort of being able to be social with people, he could move at ease between any social strata. And because of his appearance as well, because to look at him, he looks very sort of, I suppose, bland and ordinary. He wouldn't be out of place working in a bank if you look at some of his photographs, even right into the 60s and 70s. So he could get away with that sort of thing. And he just saw endless opportunity, which... Unfortunately, I think he was a bit sort of mercenary about it. He used things and he used people to get what he wanted, and then he moved on to the next thing. And something drew him to New York in the late 50s. He also had a friend in London called John Beresford, who was training as a medical practitioner. And Beresford had moved to New York in the mid 50s and taken up a high-ranking position in one of the paediatric hospitals in New York. So Hollingshead knew he had friends there, moved there. And he got hooked up with Beresford again. He got a flat in Greenwich Village, and he was sort of living the life of an expat in New York. When he got there, he found out that John Beresford had developed a massive interest in basically getting high, and John Beresford was running two separate lives. He had one flat where he lived with his wife, and then he had another flat which is his sort of weekend party house, and he was buying all manner of chemicals and drugs, because at that time there were very little restriction on anything, and there was apparently a shop in Greenwich Village where you could go and buy peyote, mescaline, any form of hallucinogenic cactus, all sorts of things. And so they were doing this, and they were having these wild parties where they were getting completely wasted and just seeing what happened. Now, to us these days, that just seems like what many people do of an average weekend. But in the very, very early 60s, that was very unusual for people to be going at it so intensely. They were really pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, particularly if you're a high-level paediatrician. But I guess that would have given them access to all sorts of pharmaceuticals which weren't available for the general public, right?
That's right. And I mean, this is where we sort of come to the LSD part of it, because Beresford and Hollingshead had heard about LSD, and Hollingshead said to Beresford, well, we really need to try this because it sounds to be quite fantastic. So using Beresford's letter-headed notepaper, they ordered some from Sandoz in New York, which was quite easy to do. All you did was send a letter in, pay your money, and it came back to you by post.
Okay, so I just thought I would read from Hollingshead's autohagiography, we should probably call it, because we don't know whether it's actually accurate or true, but about how this whole thing happened. This is in 1960. He says, a small package from Switzerland arrived in the mail one morning containing 1 gram of Dr. Hoffman's acid, which I had arranged to be sent to me. There was also a bill for $285. I'd first heard of LSD from Aldous Huxley when I telephoned him at his home in Los Angeles to inquire about obtaining some mescaline, which he'd recently been using. His information also included the name of Dr. Albert Hoffman and a caution, subsequently unheeded, to take great care if I should ever take any of the stuff. It's much more potent than mescaline, though I've used it with some quite astonishing results. There had been no difficulty obtaining even 1 gram of LSD. I simply asked an English doctor friend of mine to write the order on a sheet of New York hospital letterhead, saying I needed this ergo derivative as a control drug for a series of bone marrow experiments. Eagerly I unwrapped the package. The acid was in a small dark jar marked lot number H00047, and in appearance looked a bit like malted milk powder. My problem was how to convert the loose powder into a more manageable form. 1 gram would make 5,000 individual doses, and I was obviously going to need to measure it out in some way. I decided to randomise it by mixing it into a stiff paste made from icing sugar. I cleared the kitchen table and set to work. First I poured some distilled water into a bowl, and then mixed in the LSD. When all the acid had dissolved, I added confectioner's sugar until the mixture was a thick paste. I then transferred my divine confection, spoon by laborious spoon, into a 16-ounce mayonnaise jar, and by what magical alchemical process the stuff measured exactly 5,000 spoonfuls. In other words, 1 teaspoon of the stuff ought to contain 200 millionths of a gram, which would be sufficient for an 8 to 10 hour session, and a pretty intense one at that. I should add at this point that I had, like all good chefs, been tasting the preparation during its making with my finger, and must have absorbed about the equivalent of 5 heavy doses before I finally screwed the lid on the mayonnaise jar, which left me somewhat unprepared for what was to follow. He doesn't, rather narcissistically doesn't mention Beresford there, but what happened next, Andy?
Basically, he and Beresford were blasted into outer space, inner space, whatever space you like to call it. And for the next 12 hours, if you read Hollingshead's descriptions, he went through, what is like an archetypal psychedelic experience. He left his immediate surroundings. He became a god. He saw evolution. He saw history. Everything that could possibly happen was happening to him. And it was something he couldn't have even countenanced from his previous use of any other drug. And when he came down, he just thought, well, this is an amazing drug. We've got to do something with this. What can I do? What can I find out about it? So again, the story goes, and we've never been able to prove this or not. He says that he then rung up Aldous Huxley, because Huxley had written about drugs before and was regarded as, an intellectual authority on it. So he allegedly rang Huxley up, and Huxley said, the person you need to speak to about this is Tim Leary. And he gave him Leary's details. Now, Hollingshead thought, fair enough, I'll go see Leary. And at that time, Leary had been, he was at Harvard, and he'd been experimenting a lot with psilocybin mushrooms. He'd been to Mexico, he'd been turned on there. He thought psilocybin was the be-all and end-all of psychedelic experiences, and was sort of doing things with it at Harvard. So Hollingshead tried to get in touch with him, wrote him a letter. Leary was very gracious and said he would meet him, and they met in a cafe one lunchtime, and Hollingshead sort of spilled his heart out to Leary about how he got this new drug, and he wanted Leary to try it, and he'd come to America and he was having all sorts of family problems, and he needed sort of some support using this. And Leary said, oh yeah, I'll get back to you. Anyway, Leary didn't get back to him, so Hollingshead, being the tenacious sort of guy that he was, wrote Leary a letter saying, basically, if you don't see me by this time next Wednesday or whatever, I'm going to kill myself, which is a bit extreme.
Describe this in the book. It's absolutely extraordinary thing to say. I mean, and just to back up a little bit, because obviously we're going to come back to the kind of the bigger history of acid at some future date, but in terms of him and Beresford are in New York. They've heard about acid, and of course, acid's been around since 1938 with Hoffman, who he discovered it or synthesized it, and of course that's kind of what happened with him, isn't it? Is that he sort of did it and then accidentally kind of licked some, and then he goes off on the massive psychedelic voyage. There seems to be a repeating pattern with acid, doesn't it? Because it's so strong. And so Leary, and you say Leary knew about it. Aldous Huxley had done it by this time, had he? I mean, he'd done it. So just to set the scene, acid's in America. It's from during the 50s, and they know about it. What did they know about it? I mean, was it in the culture? Were people writing about it? I mean, who was taking it? And because the way you described it is that Hollingshead sounded surprised at what happened to him.
Yes, I mean, there's a small coterie of intellectuals and people sort of in the scientific world who'd been using it, but there probably weren't more than, I don't know, it's hard to say, probably weren't more than 100 people using it around, the late 50s, early 60s, and they were all being quite secretive about it, because some people, like Huxley, wanted to keep it to himself and for the elite. He didn't think it should be sort of spread out to the masses because it was so powerful. And then you had other people like Al Hubbard, the guy who seemed to have got his acid from strange places, possibly was working for the CIA. The CIA had used it as part of MK Ultra, their experiments to try and obtain what they thought might be a truth drug, but had abandoned it because it had become just so chaotic and they didn't know how to marshal it. So it was, a lot of people had their fingers in the LSD pie, but no one really knew what to do with it. And as then, it hadn't really got out as a recreational or sort of mass spiritual type of drug.
Yeah, I mean, and so Leary at first is not interested, or he's not interested enough in acid. He doesn't see the potential somehow. But then he meets Hollingshead, this strange creature from across the water who's proselytizing on behalf of acid, which that can be a bit annoying, I suppose. And at the second meeting, Hollingshead threatens to commit suicide. That's a quite unusual start to a relationship which was going to go on for years, right?
It is, but again, you see, I think that's part of Hollingshead's makeup. I think he saw something in Leary that he knew that if he pressed that button, saying he was going to kill himself, that Leary would respond. And that's what happened. Apparently, according to what Leary said, he was on the verge of going for a plane to a conference somewhere, I think in Mexico or something, when he got this message from Hollingshead. And he just said, I'm trying to think who was with him at the time. It may have been Ralph Metzner who was with him, and he basically dropped everything, went to pick Hollingshead up and brought him back to Leary's own house, where basically then Hollingshead moved in. He just sort of moved him into the top floor, and he became sort of a general assistant to Leary, helping him with his paperwork, helping him with his kids. He was very good with Leary's kids, apparently, and just sort of hanging out there as people came and went. And Leary at that time had quite a few people coming and going, and they were getting high on a variety of substances. But what was happening was Hollingshead was constantly trying to get Leary to try acid and saying, come up to my room, I've got this bottle of mayonnaise soaked with acid, and you really need to try it. And Hollingshead said no. Leary said no. I've seen it all with psilocybin. There can't really be much better than that. So anyway, Hollingshead persisted, and the story goes that one winter's night in I think it's late 1962. Maynard Ferguson, the jazz musician, and his wife Flo were staying at the Learys. They had a gig that weekend somewhere in the vicinity, and Leary knew them quite well. They stayed there often. So they were staying there, and Hollingshead sort of got chatty and friendly with them and said, do you want to try some of my LSD? And they were very keen to try it because they'd heard about it. So, of course, Hollingshead rushes upstairs, comes back down with his jar, gives them both a spoonful, and sits back to watch what happens. Meanwhile, Leary, who's refused a spoonful, is marking some exam papers in a corner, and the others are just sort of laid back and chatting. And all of a sudden, Flo Maynard sort of sits up and just, I think she says something like, oh, baby, you've got to try this is amazing, and Maynard agrees that yes, it is amazing. So Leary thinks, but I've got to, my friends are doing it now, I've got to do it. A bit of peer group pressure, I think. So he took a spoonful of it, and Leary's descriptions are sort of very similar to Hollingshead's descriptions of that first trip. He was just completely blasted off the planet into realms that he couldn't imagine existed. And the trip, even though it was only sort of 8 or 9 hours, seemed to go on for centuries. And again, when Leary came down, he was mind blown. He just didn't know what to do. And he was so spun out of it, really, that Leary's close friends were very concerned about him, because he appeared to latch on to Hollingshead as though the acid experience had imprinted Hollingshead as a sort of guru figure. And in a couple of cases, Leary actually refers to Hollingshead as his guru at the time, and he used to follow him around everywhere. And people like Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner and a few others were quite worried about this. But Leary sort of slowly gets to grips with it and starts to use acid quite heavily, and then it just expands from there.
I mean, and history was made. I mean, a spoonful of sugar, as they say in the song.
That's right. The loving spoonful.
The loving spoonful, of course. Yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary image, isn't it? That they're in this house. Leary at this time, even though he's experimenting, he's still marking the exam papers. He's still doing the professor thing, and up in the attic is this barking, mad sort of suicidal kind of young English guy who's just up there spooning stuff out of his mayonnaise jar, tripping on his own and persuading anybody who can to do it. And of course, their relationship, we're not going to go through this right now, we'll come back to it, but, their relationship was a strange one, wasn't it? And it went on, right the way through to the 80s. And it must have been strange even before the acid, because as you say that, if I'd said to you, Andy, will you come and do a conversation for Soho Radio, and you said no, and I'd written back to you and said, if you don't, I'm going to kill myself. I mean, you probably would have said, I'm definitely not doing it then, right? So there was something right from the beginning, before the acid, before they sort of tripped together, they made some connection, something about Hollingshead imprinted itself, didn't it, on Leary's psyche, that got him interested and, made this connection between them, right?
Yeah. It was Hollingshead's charisma. It's the thing that most people have talked about. People either loved him or hated him. Very few people were sort of, it was all right, in between. You either took to him or you didn't. And, reading things that Ralph Metzner and Richard Alpert have said about him in the early days, they were fascinated by him. They alternatively thought he was both a crank and a bit of an idiot, but they also saw him as being an absolute genius and a master magician at being able to manipulate people's minds. And he quite worried some of them. I mean, he would. I think there's one particular instance I recount in the book where one evening that they're tripping, and I think it's Ralph Metzner who starts talking about a little village in Switzerland where he had relatives, and Hollingshead chimes in and starts to say he knows that village and he knew all about it, and he just kept telling Metzner things about it, and it blew Metzner's mind because he couldn't decide if he was just playing a mind game with him or if he'd actually got that knowledge. And that was typical of Leary. He would just do. Typical of Hollingshead. He would keep at people with a particular idea or argument or something until basically he thought he'd won. And in the end, I think in that particular instance, Metzner blacked out because he couldn't cope with the intensity of Hollingshead's information and his argument about whether or not he'd been to this particular location. He liked playing mind games. And the thing about Hollingshead, he obviously found that he could navigate high-dose LSD experiences very easily. Now, some people can. I've met some people who can function on very, very, very high doses of LSD, whereas a lot of people, they freak out after 100 micrograms. So Hollingshead had this innate talent to be able to handle acid, and he just used it on everyone around him.
He must have been in some way, either emotionally robust or somehow sort of psychologically immune to the bedevilment that many of us would experience when tripping. You described acid as an emotional amplifier, and for anybody who's slightly anxious like me, kind of Woody Allen types, it's to be treated with great caution. But he didn't seem to have that. He seems to be sort of free from anxiety. I mean, maybe free from a lot of other emotions too, or just emotionally very robust.
Well, this is debatable, isn't it? You see, his daughter Vanessa told me that as far as she was concerned, he was a sociopath. So I think his ability to empathise with the emotions wasn't there, and that was part of his problem, really, because, again, just jumping forward a few years, when he's in London and he's involved with Joey Mellon and people like that, Joey Mellon said of him that he just didn't understand love. He wanted love and he yearned for it, but he hadn't got the faintest idea about how to get it or how to nurture it, and so on and so forth. So that is probably why he appeared to be sort of so robust and strong on acid, because he just didn't care about other people. But that said, everyone who tripped with him said even though he could be difficult, he was one of the best people they could ever trip with, because they felt secure in his presence. He had all the archetypes of the sort of acid guru, if you like.
Well, and that's very interesting, isn't it? Sort of sociopath / psychopath. I mean, there is this, I thought of it as a kind of, just sounds a bit pat, doesn't it? But this thing that you're born a psychopath, you're made a sociopath, and in his case, if you think about those early experiences with his father and stuff, and beating up his mother and stuff, you could kind of, that's kind of classic how to become a sociopath stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, there is a sort of strength in that, in psychopathy, isn't there? That you can be highly intelligent and ruthless, strategic, manipulative, but quite immune to the stuff that troubles ordinary mortals. But there's something more than that. I mean, okay, he is the kind of crazy English guy who's living upstairs in the attic. I mean, not your first choice of babysitter, with his mayonnaise jar spooning it out. But he sees something in Leary, he perseveres, and then Leary ends up taking acid. Okay, there's some peer pressure from Leary's other friends. Maybe that was necessary too from his musician friends, as you mentioned. But Leary does it, and boom, his consciousness is blown wide open. And then, I mean, of course, this is an historical moment in terms of the culture, in terms of psychedelic history, but also I think it's in terms of American history, and because we can come back to Britain and Albion later. I mean, because Timothy Leary and Alpert, and what they did with acid, I mean, it did transform the face of 1960s America, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And music, music, art, the culture, theatre, graphic design, and never mind all those kids that sort of give up on the Rockwell version of the future that their middle-class parents had planned for them to head west, and some of those people changed the world. It was a tremendous, significant event, right?
It was. Now, people might say, well, Leary would have got hold of acid anyway, and he may well have done, but that's not the point. He got hold of acid from Hollingshead, and it was that triggered the massive social changes in America. And because it was Leary that he targeted, and Leary was very much give acid to the people sort of person, that really helped it spread. If it had gone to anyone else, or if perhaps Leary had got hold of it much later, it might not have penetrated American society quite as pervasively and quickly as it did in the mid-60s.
Yeah, because you've got Aldous Huxley, another Brit, but a posh, intellectual, rather elitist Brit, as you say. He didn't see LSD as something for the masses, unlike Soma, of course, in his famous dystopian, utopian novel For the Future, and the drug, which was, kept the masses down. He saw this as something for the elite. Whereas, I don't know whether Hollingshead had a view on that at the time or not, but Leary certainly did see it as something for the masses. He saw it as a mechanism, as a channel to transform society, and that's what he tried to do, right?
He did, yes. I mean, the thing about Leary was, he was a contrarian. He had been all his life. He spent several years in West Point, not being spoken to by any other person in that establishment because he wouldn't sort of play the game. So he liked being difficult. And I think when Hollingshead turned him on this is a way to, in a way, get my own back on the establishment in America. And you've also got to remember Leary was kicked out of Harvard not long after because the Harvard authorities didn't like what was going on with acid there, and so he had a bit of an axe to grind, I think. So I think partly his zeal to spread it came because he was anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, and he wanted to undermine the Western way of life. And there are many clips of Leary talking about, you need to turn on, tune in, turn on, and drop out, and that was like the mantra of the 60s and 70s for many young people, and that's exactly what happened. And Hollingshead was instrumental in making that happen.
Right, so they're in the house. Leary's turned on, and this whole psychedelic wave is now in motion. So what happens with Hollingshead and Leary, and what's the next part of their life together like?
Well, they start running LSD experiments with various people, and Leary starts to develop his theories about consciousness and so on and so forth. And they were getting on swimmingly, and Hollingshead was being paid a monthly sort of stipend for his assistance with Leary. And then they had one of their many fallings out over the years. And basically what happened was Leary had gone somewhere, and Hollingshead wanted to go, I think he was to Jamaica for a holiday, and he had a cheque written which he said was validated by Leary, and I think he faked Leary's signature on the back. And in those days you could just submit a cheque and people would accept it. Anyway, the cheque bounced, and Leary found out about it, and that caused a huge rift. Another thing that caused a huge rift with him at that time was Leary paid for Hollingshead to go to a conference about psilocybin on the continent somewhere, run by Eileen Garrett, the famous parapsychologist. So he was paid for that, but Eileen Garrett also paid him as well. And when Leary found out that basically Hollingshead had been double paid, he felt ripped off, and so they parted. And Hollingshead came back to Britain for a year or so, and living in various places, doing various things. He hooked back up with Alex Trocchi and also with Brian Barrett, and it's around this time that he dabbled with heroin before, and he dabbled with speed before, but his association with Alex Trocchi and people really got him into taking heroin and speed. And what was beginning to happen was he started taking speed along with acid, because the idea there was acid can just distort time so much that seconds can, on high doses, seconds can feel like eternities. Well, add a bit of speed into that mix and you've got some forward propulsion, and that sort of changes the experience, so you're not quite as lost, if you see what I mean.
I don't really see what you mean, but I'm sort of getting a flavour. The words are making sense, but I'm just trying to imagine it.
It's hard to explain. I mean, fundamentally, on high-dose acid of the sort that was around in the early 60s, you could feel as though you'd been away for literally years or centuries, and it would feel like that. And a lot of people like that. A lot of people didn't. So add some methadone into the equation, and that gives you the motive power to go forward whilst you're still having this mind-blowing experience. And that, of course, then gives its own problems, because it was taking so much acid and heroin and speed, and speed, that he found it difficult to calm down. So he was introducing heroin into the mix the day after to come down with, and alcohol as well. So very slowly, in the sort of early to mid 60s, he, his alcoholism, which had always been there, increased, and he was getting a speed and a heroin habit as well.
That's heavy fuel. I think, as you said, so you've got acid, speed, heroin, alcohol, cannabis, right? As you said, what could possibly go wrong, with that kind of mix? I mean, how often were they doing acid, though? I mean, with Leary and stuff, did it become a daily thing for those guys? I mean,
not daily, but at least once a week, without a doubt. And later on, when we get to talk about Millbrook, it was much more intense than that. So what happened around I think it was about 1963 time, Hollingshead came back from London to America because his friend John Beresford was setting up a psychedelic clinic called Agora in New York, and it was supposed to be like a therapeutic centre, and they got some funding from a philanthropist, and it set up this sort of office suite. So it had a reception room, it had basically a tripping room that was all tricked out with nice furnishings, carpets, artwork, and so on and so forth. Fantastically good sound system and all that. And people would go there for sort of therapeutic sessions. And there's many records of people having gone there and how it helped them. Anyway, Hollingshead just turned up there one day and just basically muscled in and said, "I'm living here," and used one of the rooms as his bedroom. Now, John Beresford, by all accounts, was a Buddhist. He was very very calm, very kind, didn't believe in sort of intervening in things, and essentially let Hollingshead walk all over him. And within 6 or 7 months, Hollingshead had completely ruined Agora. Even worse, Beresford said that he knew that Hollingshead had arranged for his phones to be tapped by the FBI because he saw one of the phone taps, yet was so non-interventionist that he chose to do nothing about it. And that's interesting because if Hollingshead was doing that, this is yet another one of those events that give rise to the notion that it might have been some form of deep state agent or something like that. My version of it is that he probably did it because it was a way of getting him off something that he'd been caught doing in America, and he probably said, "Well, if I can tap Beresford's phone, will you let me off whatever sentence you were going to give me?"
Incredibly self-serving. I mean, we know, of course, that the American authorities and, the instruments and the institutions like the CIA and FBI were extremely alarmed at what was happening to youth culture in America, and were taking steps to disrupt it, if not destroy it and infiltrate it. So they got hold of Hollingshead, and purely selfishly, to get off a rap of some sort, some legal rap, that he'd kind of agreed to cooperate, and then he was going to help them bug one of his best friends, the guy who got him to America and was putting him up and feeding him, and I mean, that's quite astonishing. I mean, we are in psychopath territory then now, definitely, I think.
Definitely. I mean, the thing is, I could never find evidence that he'd been arrested for something in the States that he was using that to get off with, but I can think of no other reason why he would have arranged for Beresford's Agora Centre to be tapped if it wasn't for his own leverage for some reason. And it's also quite startling that Beresford didn't just rip the phone tap out and confront Hollingshead, which he didn't.
And it's not that Beresford himself was just getting paranoid, as has been known to happen with people taking lots of drugs.
No, not paranoid, because he actually saw the mechanism, if you like. He describes it in something he wrote. So there's no doubt about it that his phone was being tapped, and so that all fell apart. And Hollingshead drifted off again. He went to various places, including back to back to London again, where he did some broadcasting for the BBC apparently, which I've never been able to track down other than the references to it, and all the time. And you've got to remember that this is like, it's well over 50 years ago. There was no internet, there was no mobile phones, and yet Hollingshead was a master communicator. He wrote prolifically, wrote letters 2 or 3 a day to all kinds of people. He used his phone a lot transatlantically, so he was always really on top of what was going on. And he heard about Leary setting up something in this place called Millbrook in upstate New York, and he thought, ooh, got to have some of this. So he hopped on a plane, arrived at Millbrook, and introduced himself to Leary and said, basically, can I hang out here? And Leary, who was ever forgiving of Hollingshead and forgave him over and over again over the years, said, yeah, sure, come on in. And he became their resident psychedelic joker, if you like, for all the various things that took place there.
So one of the words that you've used to describe him is trickster, actually, isn't it? And I suppose that combination of an amoral character, at the same time somebody who could be incredibly good to be around, but also could totally untrustworthy. I mean, that is the kind of trickster archetype, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
They needed that then. They needed that there.
Yes, they did. And I mean, Leary's thing at Millbrook was to set up a centre where people could go and pay for high-dose sessions with Leary or one of the other main people there, so they could see what a high-dose session was like and take that back to to whatever scene they were involved in. And they were doing all sorts of strange things, like practicing techniques that Gurdjieff had evolved for sort of social behaviours and things like that. They were basically a commune trying to lead a completely different life, which was underpinned by psychedelic drugs. And initially, everything seemed to be sort of working out all right. And every Saturday night, without fail, there'd be a huge meeting in one of the big rooms there, big log fire. There'd be 10 or 12 people. They'd all take, possibly at least 1,000 micrograms of acid, and Leary would guide them on some mysterious journey, and Hollingshead would be around, and he'd be manipulating the light show or the slides, or occasionally just freaking people out by turning up outside, bouncing up and down on a strobe lit trampoline wearing a kilt, which was just a mind blast for people who'd gone there for some form of religious or spiritual experience. But people liked him because of that, because he was unpredictable, he was fun, he knew how to handle a trip. And again, one of his favourite trips there was to say to a small party of people, do you want to meet the sort of person who's at the centre of everything, the ultimate guru, if you like. And of course they'd go, yeah. So get them all completely loaded up on acid and take them on a tour of Millbrook's cellars and underground tunnels for an hour or two, and they'd be going in darkness with candlelight and shuffling through narrow spaces, and Hollingshead would be telling them all sorts of stories until he finally brought them to the end and said, right, this is it, just see this. And he'd unveil a mirror and they'd see themselves, and depending on where you were at in your trip, you'd think, wow, yes, or oh my god, no.
Yeah. So this trickster archetype that he seems to occupy is very important, particularly as you say later when he comes back to England. Leary is very serious, isn't he? In many ways, he's esoteric. He's Tibetan Book of the Dead. He's Gurdjieff. He's set and setting, and it's laying out a sort of a route plan and a map for your trip, and fasting, and he's approaching it as a kind of spiritual discipline. And I suppose that Hollingshead provides a foil to that. He's the guy who's outside the window with a strobe and a kilt bouncing up and down on a trampoline. So it's a kind of, he's providing some sort of foil to Leary, which I'm assuming that Leary himself really valued.
That appears to be the case. And Hollingshead was quite formal in many of his trips, although he could play the trickster. But what was happening was, at a period of time when Hollingshead was at Millbrook, Leary got married and went to India on his honeymoon. Now, when that happened, that's when the rot set in, because basically the sort of spiritual side of Millbrook dropped away, and it became a lot of competing people seeing basically how high they could get and how high they could stay for how long. And for instance, there was a bowling alley, or a place they called the bowling alley, on the Millbrook estate, and Leary and I think Alpert and some of the others just holed up there for 2 or 3 weeks and just took acid all day. They just kept upping the dose. They were taking thousands of micrograms at a time just to see how high they could get and how high they could stay. So it was basically a pissing contest with psychedelics,
right.
if you
so
like.
So Leary is in India doing the spiritual thing, but Hollingshead and Alpert, Ramdas as he became, they're sort of back home just going hell for leather, heading for the psychic horizon.
That's right, yeah. And then there were lots of other people who were joining in it as well. And it was all getting very fraught, and there were factions forming, and Millbrook couldn't operate as it wanted to, and it was all falling apart. And also at this time, Hollingshead was sending Leary acid to India, so he had something to eat while he was there, basically. So he was keeping him supplied. Leary came back in the spring of 65, I think it was, and realised that things weren't right and they needed to be sorted out. So again, the legend has it is that Leary, Metzner and Alpert conjured up this idea that Hollingshead should go to London in the autumn of 1965 and basically create a vanguard there for the American psychedelic experience, which would be exemplified in Easter 1966, when Leary would come over. They were going to hire the Royal Albert Hall and various other big places in cities across Europe and spread the gospel. And Leary's expectation was that everyone would sort of fall beneath his sway, and he'd be an even bigger guru than he was in America.
So the psychedelic movement in America is not in full flood yet. We're not at the Summer of Love, etc. But it's gone into the culture, thanks to a large extent to Leary and Alpert, you could say, to Hollingshead, and the sort of earthquake is beginning. The transformation is coming.
That's right. I mean, the first it's difficult to say how acid actually got out to the masses in the early 60s in America. Some was leaking out from the hospitals that were using it for psychotherapeutic purposes, but there wasn't an actual illicit LSD lab in America until 1963. So it was being manufactured illegally for the masses then, and then there were more labs set up between 63 and 66, and by 1966 it was sort of fairly widely available if you knew who to talk to, in the major cities and out on the west coast. So there was a scene developing. The remnants of the beatnik scene were hooking onto acid and thinking it was amazing, and the whole hippie thing that we come to know later had its genesis there.
There's the whole Kool-Aid acid test thing with Ken Kesey. Is that a little bit later?
That's sort of 65, I think. But that is interesting, because what was happening as more and more people outside the medical and educational and scientific establishments were taking acid, the ways of taking it and dealing with it were changing. Some people were very, very committed to the Leary formal, fast for a day before, sit in a circle, read sacred texts, all that sort of thing. Whereas others like Ken Kesey and other people on the West Coast were more of a, no, let's just take this and just see what happens and have a mind blast. And that's where the acid tests came from. Lots of people in one place, all on high doses of acid, just doing whatever came to them naturally. I suppose a very embryonic version of a rave, maybe, but, on a lot more drugs.
Yeah, and there's that connection with the Beat Generation. Neil Cassidy, who's Dean Moriarty in Kerouac's On the Road, he's the driver of Ken Kesey's bus, and the merry pranksters are going around just giving acid out randomly.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, they were just giving it to anyone who would ask, and not saying this is how you should deal with it. Just see what happens. Now, 90% of the time that almost certainly worked out all right, and people had a ball of the time. But when it went wrong, there are various tape recordings and some video of people freaking out on acid, and it's not a pretty sight. And I mean, anyone who's had a really bad trip on acid knows it's not a good thing. So that was the downside to it, and I think you've always got to bear in mind that there was a downside to the psychedelic experience.
And Leary, of course, he's much more. He's got this vision for acid transforming society in a much more structured, formal way. And he is going to send Hollingshead back to London. I think you talk about it as probably mixed motives. Part of it is, okay, this is the next step, building the bridgehead to Europe to take this psychedelic acid revolution to the masses of Europe. Also, there's a bit of it is, let's just get Hollingshead out of here, because he's like unbearable at times. So it's a combination of things. So they sort of like talk him into going back to London on a more sort of permanent basis anyway, with this mission.
Yes, I mean, basically, I think it was. I think it might have been September or October 1965. The Leary, Albert, and Metzner took Hollingshead to the docks, gave him a load of acid to take to Britain, and loaded him up with a load of copies of Tibetan Book of the Dead and so forth, and waved him off on a ship to Britain. And the sort of legend has it that Leary or one of the others said to each other, "Well, that's put psychedelic research back another 10 years, sending him to Britain, but at least it's got rid of him from us."
Yeah, you can sympathise. Let's leave it there. Let's leave him there on the ship, heading back towards these shores, and we'll hear more tales of the Divine Rascal next time when he's back in Albion. Thank you so much, Andy, for this.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
It was a pleasure. You can check out Andy's book, The Divine Rascal, on Strange Attractor Press. It's amazing. Check us out on www.bureauoflostculture.com. Hear you next time. Remember, watch out for the bad acid. Have a safe trip.